Let's go, break it down, put it there, bring it on, step it up, right there, break it down, put it there, here we go, step it up, bring it on, let's go,
Welcome to your screen, welcome to Studie Generale, but most of all, welcome to this lecture. Before we dive into the subject, first this. It's an open door that we of Studie Generale miss our cultural live events due to the pandemic. Concerts, plays, spoken word, etc. But in the coming 2 months, we have more online lectures on culture and arts than you're used to from us. We want culture and arts not only to be consumed as an audience, but we would like you to think about it and hear academic perspectives on those subjects. Today, we kick off with street poetry. Poetry, to some an elite art form, is surrounding us much more than we think. Instagram poetry, tattoo poetry, poetry in coffee mugs, and so on. But today, our focus is on the poetry on the streets, the walls, the bridges, monuments, and more. Our guest of today, Kila van der Starre, just finished her PhD research project on poetry of the page, and will take you online through these streets. You can ask her questions in this chat. Kila, the screen is yours.
Thank you, David, and welcome everyone to this lecture on street poetry, which I've been really looking forward to. Lovely to see you all have joined us online. I will be talking about street poetry. I'm a literary scholar in Utrecht, and as David said, I wrote a dissertation about poetry off the page, and one of my case studies is street poetry. Let's dive in. Of course, I would like to start with a poem. If you are a Dutch speaker, you can read the original Dutch text here. I will be reciting the English translation. This is a poem by Stijn Franke, a Flemish poet living in Belgium and the former city poet of Antwerp. He wrote this poem during his city poet period in the city of Antwerp. And the poem is called A Good City Poem, een goed stadsgedicht. A good city poem you recognize immediately. It has a striking title, it opens in a witty manner, and in the best case, it hangs in the way on the bottom of a huge bridge. It's funny, but not over the top. And it surprises. Just in time, it ends up asking something such as the wretched question, isn't this ship calmly transporting the time you are so urgently wasting here? We could say this is a very traditional poem, and in this case, I don't mean traditional in the way of ending rhyme or maybe meter, the ordered rhythm in language. No, in this case, I mean that this is a very traditional poem because it uses the lyrical form. And the lyrical form means that there is an I, a speaker, a subject, talking to a you. In the Dutch form, an u, so the formal version of you. And, which is also typical for the lyrical form in poetry, that you who is being spoken to is not speaking back. So it's a monologue. And this traditional form of lyrical poetry was the very first form of poetry when poetry originated centuries ago in an oral way. So when a poet was always standing and live reciting their poetry to a live audience that was in the same space and time. I'm going to show you what this poem looks like in the public area of Antwerp. And this is the way it looks like. So it's actually hanging under a bridge, the London Bridge in Antwerp. And when Stijn Franke was writing this poem, he knew that he was writing it for this exact location in the city. Now, when we reread this poem, knowing that it's hanging under the bridge, it still is, in the city of Antwerp, there are certain aspects of this poem that actually are reactivated in a more active way. And one of those aspects has to do with that lyrical form that I was talking about. Namely, the you that is being spoken to by this I, this subject in the poem, can quite literally be you if you are standing in Antwerp in front of this bridge, especially when the bridge is open and you are actually reading the poem at that moment. And by that, I mean that you might be thinking some of the things that are being spoken to you in the poem. For example, you might be surprised that you came across this poem if you didn't know it was hanging there. You might also be wondering, oh, where's the time going? You know, I'm in a hurry, I have to go somewhere. You might also find this a very funny poem, just like poem is telling you. So this lyrical addressing, it's addressing you. This form is actually becoming quite literal if you're standing there and reading the poem in the public area. So this is the type of poetry that I want to talk about for the next 30 minutes or so, street poetry. And I especially want to focus on the way that there are different ways in which the meaning of a poem can be influenced or affected by the fact that it is being read in the public areas, in our streets. But before I dive into that a bit more, I just want to present this question to you. One of the main questions in my PhD research in Utrecht. In which situations and media do Dutch adults come in contact with poetry? It's one of my main questions, and in my dissertation I answered it by doing a questionnaire research. So together with Nederlands Letterenfonds and Stichting Lezen, I did a questionnaire where I asked 1,000 average Dutch adults, as we would say, how they come across poetry in their daily lives. And we asked them to think about 40 different types of poetry experiences. And we asked them, how often does this occur in your life? So if you are living in the Netherlands, maybe you are a Dutch person, if you're living here, maybe you could just think about this question for yourself. Where do you come across poetry in your daily life? In which situations? In which media? In which moments in your life do you encounter and use poetry? While you're thinking about that question for yourself, I just want to make two side notes explicit in this research. We researched adults, Dutch adults, so they were 18 years old or older. So this means that the school experiences of poetry in class, in education, were not considered in this questionnaire. And secondly, we excluded song lyrics from our definition of poetry in this research. And I didn't do that because I don't believe song lyrics can be poetry. I do believe that is the case. Bob Dylan, need I say more? But we did this very consciously to know exactly what we were researching, because nearly everyone hears a song lyric every day. And we wanted to be very specific in what kind of poetry texts people experience outside of the music genre. So I'll show you the top 10. As I said, we discussed 40 different poetry experiences with these people, but this is the top 10, and I'll just talk to you about every example in this top 10. So number 1 is poetry during private events. You can think of listening to a poem during a funeral, or maybe reading a poem on a card that you receive from friends or family who just got a baby. On the second place is poetry on television. 72% of Dutch adults experience this in different frequencies in their lives. Nico Dijkshoorn, who you see on the slide, is perhaps a very big reason for this number 2. He used to be the poet laureate for the television program De Wereld Draait Door, which millions of people watched. Number 3, there it is, street poetry, which we'll be talking about today. Number 4 is poetry in magazines. Of course, there are literary magazines in which people read poetry, but they have a very small audience. This number 4 poetry in magazines is especially poetry in glossy magazines like Flow or Happiness or Psychology magazines. They always contain poetry. Number 5 is coming across poetry in other people's houses, like on posters or pillowcases. Number 6 is coming across poetry in newspapers. You can think of our poet laureate in the Netherlands. You can think of our city poets who publish poetry in newspapers. But you can also think of poetry in obituaries and funeral announcements. Number 7 is listening to poetry during private events, so the oral form of number 1. Number 8 is poetry on social media. For example, Instagram poetry, also something I research. This is significantly more relevant for young people and for women. Number 9 is poetry on the radio. And number 10 is poetry on websites which are not social media. For example, the big Dutch language website gedichten.nl. So if we look at this entire top 10, what strikes us? Well, first of all, the entire top 10 is only forms of coming across poetry, okay? Not really actively engaging with poetry in a situation, but then coming across poetry anyway. There are lots of oral forms in this top 10, which is interesting because often it is said that poetry used to be oral and now it's written. But these results show us that at the beginning of the 21st century, poetry is actually a very oral form. Mainly collective and social forms of poetry experiences. So engaging in poetry together with your friends or family or in your social network. Mainly free forms, by which I mean people don't pay for these poetry experiences, right? In this entire top 10, of course, sometimes you pay to buy a newspaper or a magazine, but the poetry itself is presented to you for free of charge. So if we look at this top 10 in the Netherlands, it's quite logical that there are not many poets who can live off their poetry in our country. There's no books in the top 10. Of course, we did ask people about how often do you read poetry books, but it ended much lower. And if you look at all these frequencies together, all these types of poetry, all these media, then the main conclusion of this research is that nearly all Dutch adults experience poetry, nearly 100%. So it's really hard looking at these results to say that poetry is dead, or to say that poetry is a very small genre, or to say that it's very elite. No, these results show us that poetry is a very big and popular genre for many, many people in the Netherlands. If you are a Dutch speaker and you're interested in these results and many more conclusions, you can download this research report for free. It's called Poëzie in Nederland, written by me. So let's focus on that number 3 in the top 10, poetry in public areas. In 2017, when I was still writing my dissertation, I wanted to know a lot more about street poetry, but I discovered that no one really knew where these street poems were, who written by whom, who had put them there, who paid for these street poems. So I decided to launch this website, straatpoëzie.nl. It's a crowdsourcing website, which means that everyone who wants to can add examples of street poems onto the map. The map consists of the Netherlands and Flanders. By now, so 3 years later, we have more than 2,600 examples of street poems have been added to this map. So you can zoom into the map on straatpoëzie.nl. I've zoomed into Eindhoven, and you can see the different labels, and every label is a poem. And if you click on the label, you will see the title of that street poem, you will see the name of the poet, and if you click on Bekijk gedicht, look at the poem, you will see a picture and you will see lots of information about the street poem. For example, this one by Merel Morre in Eindhoven, this was the image that was used in the promotion of this online event. On the website, if you're interested in street poetry in general, I gathered lots of reading tips. I also gathered some teaching ideas. If you are a teacher and you would like to do something with street poetry, please check out the website. So this database gives me lots of information about street poetry. For example, what characterizes street poetry? If we have a look at those 2,600 poems that have been added, which can be read in the public area. First of all, I just want to emphasize that street poetry is not a new phenomenon. It's very, very old. It's older than poetry books. These are two examples of colleague academics who have written about this historical form of street poetry. Herman Pleij wrote about street poetry in the Netherlands in the 1400s and 1500s. He said poetry was everywhere, on doors, on mirrors, on clothes, on flags, everywhere. And the other book, very interesting, by Gilliard Fleming, she wrote about graffiti in the early modern England days, and she even claims that for centuries and centuries, poetry was especially written on walls, and that walls and buildings were actually the #1 material carrier for literature and not paper. The interesting thing is, if you walk around the public area of the Netherlands, you can still see poems, street poems that are centuries old. For example, this poem by Joost van de Vondel from the 16th century can still be read in the Kalverstraat in Amsterdam. Secondly, street poetry is everywhere. Cities, city centers, suburbs, villages, nature parks, the islands in the Netherlands, bridges, tunnels, motorways, cycling paths, anything you can think of, you can come across poetry. Thirdly, Several types of material carriers are used for street poetry. Here you can see some examples in Leiden and in Rotterdam and in Utrecht. The wall is often used. I would say that is the #1 street poetry form, painted on a wall. But on the left side, on the bottom side of the slide, you can see neon lights being used. And you can also see the road itself, the stones being used for poetry in Utrecht. I'll give you some more examples, and for today I've chosen lots of examples in Eindhoven. So you have lots of traditional mural poetry, so painted on a wall in Eindhoven. This is another one by Merel Morre. She used to be the city poet of Eindhoven. That's why there's many of her to be found in your city. Here's also one in the Prins Hendrikstraat. This is a very new one by the same poet, Merel Morre. This was placed here in the Torenallee in August this year, and it was actually a poem that specifically wrote for the community of Eindhoven during the COVID crisis. So it's really big, painted on the wall to kind of help people to get through these difficult times. I also really like this one in the Julianastraat, a poem by Henk Renting. Ik kom thuis, doe mijn zorgen uit, hang mijn humeur aan de kapstok. Ik kijk in je ogen en trek je liefde aan. It's love poetry. Also different types of fonts being used. For example, this handwriting type, a poem by Chris van Lenteren, really big on a wall of a building, a flat, but it kind of looks like it's maybe written in a diary or like in a letter, maybe a love letter. This is also one of my favorites in Eindhoven. This is in the Archimedestraat. What I like about this one is it's a mystery. We don't know who wrote this poem. If you do, please contact me. And I also like the fact that this is really visually very exciting. It's painted in a kind of rain-like, waterfall design into this wall. And the poetry itself is very experimental. It reminds me of Dadaist poetry from the 1920s. Sound is a very important aspect of this poem, maybe even more important than meaning. And this poet, who we don't know who it was, uses alliteration, so the repetition of consonants, to kind of get a rhythm and sound into this poem. We could also find some really old poetry by some canonical Dutch poets in Eindhoven, like Adriaan Roland Holst. This can be found near the station in a kind of monument architecture function of street poetry. We can find poetry in street art and graffiti, like this poem by Nienke Esther Grote, who also used to be a city poet in Eindhoven. We can find poetry in Eindhoven on cemeteries, such as the Sint Catharina Cemetery on the Frederik van Eendeplein, very nicely made on this stone, natural stone, on the ground, also by Merel Morre. This was also, I thought, a very original one, a poem by Willem Kloos, also a very famous historical poet in the Netherlands, placed on different parts of flat buildings in the city. I'm just going to skip these, maybe this one, just to show that there's also lots of bilingual and multilingual poetry to be found on the map of straatpoëzie.nl, also in Eindhoven. Here we see a Dutch poem by Jannie Habraak, translated into Arabic. So different communities can enjoy the street poetry because of the translation on the wall. So another characteristic which is important, which the database shows me, is that street poetry gives us a very big mix of poetry, by which I mean that famous poets, so poets that are also have been known to us for centuries, and the poets that we teach at schools, so the canonical poets, are mixed with lots of non-canonical poets. So poets that are not well known, poets that are maybe famous but only in their own region, only in their own community. We also see a very big mix of contemporary poets who are still alive and historical poets who have already died. We see a mix of poetry specifically written for locations, but also mixed with poetry that people have taken from books, so publication poetry on paper. And we see a mix of top-down and bottom-up. And by that, I mean that sometimes it's the council or the Dutch government that decide to place the poetry in the public areas, for example, on monuments or on big buildings. But there are also lots of examples of top-down initiatives, by which I mean that individuals or maybe neighbors or maybe school teachers themselves decide to go and look for possibilities to create poetry and to place it specifically in the public areas. One last thing about this mix aspect is that street poetry is much more diverse, much more inclusive than poetry in books. For example, the poetry that we present in our school books to children or in our collections of poetry. By which I mean that in the mix of poetry in public areas, there are many more young poets being presented and many more female poets being presented. Although I must add that the mix of poetry in our public areas is mainly written by white poets, so the diversity and ethnicity for the poets is quite low. To conclude this lecture, I would just like to explain to you a little piece of theory, a little piece of theoretical thinking that I use in my research, and maybe just to invite you to look at street poetry in a slightly new way. Maybe the next time you walk through your city, Eindhoven or whatever city or village, and you see a street poem, maybe I can invite you to reflect on the street poetry in a new way. And I'll be using this theory by George Bornstein, which he wrote in his 2001 book, Material Modernism. And he says the following: the literary text consists not only of words, its linguistic code, but also of the semantic features of its material instantiations, its bibliographical code. So what he's actually saying here is that we should talk about two different codes when we talk about texts. And he says all texts have these two codes, but especially when we're looking at poetry texts, this can be relevant. So we have the linguistic code, which is all the verbal elements of a poem, the text itself. Okay, so this is the code that you would look at when I ask you to read a poem and I ask you, what is this poem about? Or how many words does this poem have? Or which words rhyme? Those questions, you would all look at the linguistic code of a poem. On the other hand, we have the bibliographical code, says Bornstein. And those are the material elements of the poem, the material carrier itself. So for example, the bibliographical code of this text, which I'm now saying to you, is, in my case, a laptop, the webcam. It is also maybe in your case a telephone or maybe a big screen you're looking at. On this slide, for example, the bibliographical code is the fact that it's a digital PowerPoint slide, but also the fact that I made the word bibliographical code and linguistic code red on the slide. The other letters are black. Okay, so those are all the material elements of a text. And according to Bornstein, and this is the important thing, both the linguistic code and the bibliographical code contribute to the meaning of a poem. So he is actually saying not only what the poem says in language is important, but also the way that the language is presented to us. And actually, I think you all already know what he means. Perhaps you can think of people who send you an SMS or an app in capital letters, which sometimes if you read that message, it feels quite aggressive, like it's as if someone is shouting at you. Well, if they would have written that message in a lowercase, it would have been a much more friendly text. Even if those two texts in lowercase and capital case, the text itself is exactly the same. Okay, so we actually know that the way that language is presented to us also adds meaning to the text, not only the words itself. So George Bornstein uses this theory to talk about the meaning of poetry in different media. I would like to add that in my research, I don't don't use the term bibliographical code, but I use the term material code. And I do that quite consciously because the word bibliographical, biblio means book in Greek, and Bornstein only looks at books. So he looks at different types of paper, different types of colors, different types of fonts. And I want to use his theory to look at poetry in a much broader sense, to look at street poetry, for example, but also Instagram poetry or poetry tattoos, all the things I do research on, just to see how those material elements contribute to the meaning of poetry. So that's why I prefer the term material code, and from now on I'll use that term instead. So when you come across a street poem, you can always ask yourself these two questions. How does the linguistic code contribute to the meaning of the poem? So what does the poem mean textually? Which words do I see? Which words do I understand? Which words don't I understand, etc.? And two, how does the material code contribute to the meaning of the poem? How is the poem presented to me? Is it painted on a wall? What are the colors? What are the other designs used? Okay, I'll give you some examples. This is a poem by Wisława Szymborska. She's a Polish poet, one of my favorites. And I'll read this one in English. She wrote it in Polish originally. To my own poem. At the best of times, you, my poem, will be carefully read, commented on, and remembered. In a worse case, only read. The third possibility, written, indeed, but after a while thrown in the bin. You also have a fourth way to go. You will disappear unwritten, humming to yourself with contentment. I really like this poem. So it's about all the different lives that a poem can have. Okay, so how does a poem that is written by someone, how does it end up? And Szymborska writes about the different versions of a poem's life, so to say. And just to note that she also uses the lyrical form. Perhaps you already noticed this. So you will disappear unwritten. So the I is talking to the poem and is as if it could speak back, but it's not speaking back. I'll just show you how this poem in the Dutch translation was put on a wall in Leiden in this way. And of course, the interesting thing is that if you are in Leiden and you read this poem on the wall, that it can invite you to think, hang on, there's another way that a poem can end up, and that's on a wall. Okay, so the poem doesn't talk about this option. It talks about it can be commented on and remembered, it can be only read, it can end up in the bin, or it can just disappear without being written. But I think there's another option, and that is that it ends on the wall. So the material code of the street poem, the fact that it is on a wall, the fact that it has been painted there, the fact that you can read it when you are walking through the public area actually gives extra meaning to the poem. It invites you to think about other aspects of the poem. Here, for example, which option for a poem's life is missing here? Very playful way, I think, to choose this poem to put it on a wall. Another example, this is a poem by the Dutch poet Eda Gerhardt. The original is called Onvervreemdbaar, and I'll read a translation that I made myself. Inalienable. This will not be taken from us, reading and breathlessly turning the page, far away from everydayness. Those who read may be lonely. They have been so since childhood. They are beckoned by a world where the great, the timeless continue to be, to whom we may be small, the only ones who never reject us. We could interpret the linguistic code of this poem, so the text itself, the language itself, as a poem about reading books. Okay, so the speaker here, the I, is talking about the experience of losing yourself in a book, perhaps in a novel, but it could also be a non-fiction book. So sitting somewhere alone in silence, paging through a book, reading and really getting involved with all the characters in the book, really being in that fictional world. This poem has been placed in the public area in Flanders in many, many places. I'll just show you one, but there are several. This poem was placed in Delft, for example, in this way. So as you can see, it has been designed as a bench. Okay, so it's a bench that you can sit on. And the bench itself has been designed as a book that is lying on its side and has been opened. And actually, you know, the sitting space is the inside of the book. And the poem has been put on there, has been printed or painted or stuck onto this design. I must add that this bench is in front of a bookshop in Delft. So actually the linguistic code of this poem about reading books is very clearly associated with this location, because it's in front of a bookshop, and the bookshop owners initiated this poem here. But on the other hand, of course, the material code, so the fact that you can sit on it in the public areas, perhaps if you sit on this bench, maybe a stranger will sit next to you and you will talk to that person maybe about the poem, means that the linguistic code and the material code in this poem are kind of opposite. It's maybe a little bit of a paradox, because this poem, the linguistic code, is about how it's lovely to sit somewhere without any other people, just individually reading in a paper book. While this poem here is placed in the middle of everydayness, in the middle of public areas, in the middle of your community and all the other people in the public area, and it has nothing to do with a book. The reading itself and location is associated with books. So also this is very playful. The material code and the linguistic code are related to each other, but also have some opposite aspects that really creates a tension here in the way that the poem is presented and the way that the poem becomes meaningful to readers here in Delft. I'm going to end my lecture here. I hope you enjoyed it. I also hope that when you walk around or cycle around in the public area and you see a street poem, that you might stand still and have a new look, a new take on how to read street poetry. And I would also like to invite you, if you are interested, to visit the website straatpoëzie.nl. It is in Dutch, so for Dutch speakers this can be interesting. And I would also like to invite you, if you ever come into a village or a nature park or some place where not many people come and you see a street poem, it could be worth it to take a look on this map to see whether that example has already been added, because we have already collected 2,600 examples on this map, which is available for everyone to look at, all the information. But I don't know how many examples there are in total, of course. So if you find one and it's a place where not many people come, it could be worth checking it out. And it's very easy on this website to add examples of street poetry. You don't have to make an account. You can do it anonymously. If you don't know anything about the poem except for the location and the name of the poem, it's fine. You can just do a little bit of it. You could just fill in a little bit of information, and together we will build this database of street poetry out to this really big website. That would be great. Thank you very much for your attention, and I would gladly hear the questions that you have and the comments that you have. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Kila. Before we get into the online questions, I have a more personal question. How did you yourself get interested in poetry?
Actually, so I studied literary studies, literatuurwetenschap in Utrecht, and I was always very interested in poetry in an academic way. And at one point, I realized that in my spare time, in my free time, I would be watching poetry on YouTube. I'd be going to poetry slams. I knew people with poetry tattoos, but all those type of poetry forms were never discussed at the university. Okay. And I thought, street poetry is so big, a phenomenon, let's dive into that.
And you did that quite well, I just saw and heard. We have a question from Amber. Does street poetry affect the culture of the city, or does the culture of the city affect the street poetry?
Oh, that's a lovely question. I think the answer is that both is of course the case. I think it's a ping pong between those two things. The fact that many city poets who are appointed by city councils spread or get the opportunity to spread their poetry in the city itself, of course, already shows this relationship. So they often write poetry about the city and inhabitants. For example, Merel Morre, who wrote about Eindhovenaren, so the inhabitants of Eindhoven in the COVID situation. And then the council decides to put her poem really big on this building. So I think the interaction is very interesting. One of the aspects I didn't talk about in this lecture is the negative reactions to street poetry. Okay. So of course, sometimes certain neighborhoods, certain inhabitants can react in a kind of protesting way, especially when they weren't asked about their opinion about which poem, what kind of language. So there's always interaction.
Okay. Then a question of Tom. What's the craziest or most interesting place you've ever encountered street poetry?
Oh, I love these questions. Actually, so I live in Utrecht and I've been living here for years. And when I started the website, straatpoëzie.nl, I thought, I'll know all the examples in Utrecht. Like no one can show me a new example. Boy, was I wrong. Yeah, there's so many examples that you have to know about. And my favorite one in Utrecht is this sewage pit. So a rioolput, a sewage pit on the ground. I think I probably cycled over that like 1,000 times. And in the sewer pit, circle thing in the metal, a poem by Bloem has been put there. And he's a very famous, canonical, big poet. And in this really strange, location in the middle of the street, on this sewer pit where you have to look down and you have to know this entire poem by Bloem. So I really like that example.
And what was it about? About sewer or about flowers? No, not about flowers.
No, it's about water. So it's about, and actually he wrote it about a specific location, the Bermudeweert in Utrecht. But the location of the poem is not the Bermudeweert. But the interesting thing is that, of course, the sewage connects all the canals in Utrecht, all the houses to each other. So the poem is about water and the streaming of water and streaming of life. So I do see some connection between the linguistic code and the material code here. Okay.
Then a question by Joep. Have you also looked into the perception and effect of certain street poems on the reader?
Yes. In some cases. So in that questionnaire that I was talking about earlier, we also asked people whether they actually like coming across poetry when they're not looking for poetry themselves. And I think street poetry is a very big part of this. And we asked them how they would rate those experiences. And 2/3 of Dutch people, they like coming across poetry in unexpected moments. And we also asked them, when you come across a poem, for example, in the street, how strong is the urge that you feel to read or listen to more poetry because of this moment? And nearly half of the Dutch people say that they would like to read or listen to more poetry after coming across poetry as a surprise. So in this research report that I also showed you on a slide, I also give some advice to the literary sector and to councils. I do think that these moments of street poetry encounters have lots of potential. So actually, we could maybe give people more names of poets, give them more ways to experience poetry at that moment.
Okay, and then a somewhat critical question, but a good one. Can you really translate poems without losing too many aspects of the original?
No, you can't.
No, you can't.
Every translation of a poem is a new poem. That's what lots of people say, and I agree. It's so difficult to translate ambiguities, for example, when one word means several things. It's often impossible. But I do think that translating poetry is one of the best ways to read poetry, because it really gets you, you have to focus, you have to concentrate on the details. If you like reading poetry and writing poetry, for example, I would invite you to translate poetry, maybe a poet you like, into a different language, and it really gives you a new perspective on the poem.
Okay, it's about time to wrap up. One last personal question. What do you think of the quality of the poetry in houses? That was one of the themes, like the pillows, the mugs, and especially the one I personally find the most disgusting, the Xenos styles. You know them?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I also mentioned them in my dissertation. So of course, like Live, Love, Life, well, we could discuss whether that's a poem or not, but we also have the Xenos, like real poems, like In This House, We Are Respectful. So in my research, I use I call that a functionalistic definition of poetry, which means that as a literary scholar, I do not impose my definition of poetry top down, but I let people decide for themselves whether they find something to be poetry or not. Okay, so some people will say those Xenos poem texts are not poems, and some will say they are. So everyone, of course, should know that for themselves. But one of my case studies in the dissertation is about Clint, which is a Dutch foundation. Yeah. And they choose, I think, lovely, lovely poems, really good poems for posters and mugs and bags and pens and whatever you can think of, pillowcases. And their selection, I think, is very good. So there's lots of diversity there. Okay.
Now, once again, thanks a lot, Kila, for enlightening us. Thanks for watching at home. For the viewers at home, the use registration link can appear any second now in the chat boxes of our socials. Hope you enjoyed it and hope to see you next Wednesday with Professor Kramer about new energy systems. See ya!